The Tom Woods Show, episode 2226.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Come on now, folks. If you ain't going to start that side hustle now, then when? Check out my free ebook, 5 Paths to an Online Income, where I take you step by step through 5 things that I do that keep food on the Woods household table and how you can do them too. Check it out at pathstoincome.com. Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. Our old friend Gene Epstein is with us again. It's always so much fun to talk to Gene, and this particular episode was entirely my idea. Sometimes people come to me with ideas for episodes. This was 100% my idea. Gene had a recent debate at his Soho Forum, which you all know about very well, and it had to do with capitalism and whether capitalism, quote unquote, or the free market was responsible for, let's say, the sluggish growth of the U.S. economy in recent decades. And I thought Gene's opening statement just crushed his opponent. It's just point by point. I emailed Gene after hearing it. I hadn't heard the rest of the debate. I just said, that was a slaughter. So I thought, let's pick this apart and talk about it, make an episode out of it. But Gene, let's begin by talking about what the Soho Forum is up to these days. You all know Gene has a storied career, credentials as long as his arm, but now he's doing this really, really important work with this debate series. What can we look forward to next?
Well, I think our next debate is already practically selling out, so please rush into thesohoforum.org for tickets, because we're going to be featuring Jay Bhattacharya arguing for focused protection against Sten Verman, who is a medical professor at Yale University. So it's going to be a very informed debate. And I know, Tom, you've had Jay on at least a couple of times on your show. And I do think that of all of the good people who've taught me about what's been going on with the pandemic and with the lockdowns, I think Jay is number one most informed source. So I'm privileged that he's going to be defending a resolution about focused protection, and that I'm going to give him as much time as I possibly can. Well, it's going to be a 90-minute debate similar to the debate that I just did with Benjamin Appelbaum of the New York Times. That will be November 15th. That's a Tuesday evening, November 15th. And I do expect a pretty big crowd.
Well, let me intervene just a second, Gene. I am sure 90% of the listeners know what you mean by focused protection, but if you don't know that term, you don't know that we're debating the lockdowns in effect.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for bringing me into the straight and narrow and not using terms people don't know. Although, I mean, I shouldn't elaborate on it too much. The focused protection was, I think, a very well-chosen term that was floated initially and put out there by the great Barrington Declaration, of which Jay Bhattacharya, professor at Stanford, was one of the key signatories. And essentially, without elaborating on it too much, it's essentially that you can focus on those people who do need badly to be protected. And that's essentially informed by the idea that you have limited resources. And in the case, as Jay would argue, in the case of the kind of pandemics we have, there really is a population that needs to be protected, and you want to leave the rest alone. So I guess it's a debatable proposition, but I think it's a very compelling one. I will be moderating the debate. However, I will be doing it in a neutral fashion. Perhaps you want to improve on my definition of focused protection?
No, that's absolutely perfect, as long as people know that that's what it is. So you can still do the live stream. Is that right?
Yes, it will be live streamed. And in fact, we have a new policy where we release the video of it right away, goes out immediately. So what you see when you're live streaming is exactly what comes out the following morning and goes out there on YouTube. It then comes out a few days later, as we did with the debate I just had on podcast. And it is brought out by Reason TV. They have done wonderfully by us. They're very good at promoting us. And I do want to promote Reason TV a little bit and tell a tale out of school that the guy who runs Reason TV is a Rothbardian. And Reason TV does have a lot of great content on YouTube. And the reason I know that he's a Rothbardian is that he happens to be my son.
Yes, right. He's also an Epsteinian.
Yes. Is he an Epsteinian? Whatever that term means. But I think it's true. And actually, Tom, I always look for world's records. You've had Jim Epstein on your show twice. You've had me on your show. Is there any other father-son combo that you've had on your show? Rack your brain. You had David Friedman on a couple of times, 2 times. But then I noticed that when you had Seasteading, you didn't do Patrick Friedman. You did a guy who was associated with Seasteading.
Right. So, I've met Patrick Friedman, but no, I didn't have him on. I think you guys are the only fathers. There's certainly no mother-daughter duo, and I don't think there's been any other father-son duo on the Tom Woods Show. Okay. So that's something to
crow about. You've had him on twice. And indeed, his content is great. I also happen to know that a couple of other people at Reason are Rothbardians. I tell this tale out of school only to appeal to the Mises people and others of your listeners to recognize that there might be a fair amount of overlap between the content that you hear from Reason and the content that you might hear from another place like the Mises Institute. So I do recommend Reason TV's YouTube channel. But Tom, I had a little other business that I wanted to get past. I wanted a quote from a note that you handed me when we last met for lunch. You, me, my wife, and your wife, Jenna. And the last part of the note that you handed me read as follows: "The work you do is important, so please accept the enclosed as a token of appreciation for your work and our friendship. All the best, Tom W." And of course, I was rather stunned by what I has colloquially called a very chubby check that you contributed in terms of actual smackers, as you like to call fiat money, to my Soho Forum. And I'm really grateful to you for that. You're not a foundation, Tom. You're just a guy who's done okay in life. And that was an extremely generous contribution, for which I thank you. And I hope and I plan to spend that money prudently and effectively in my Soho Forum. So thank
you, Gene. Tom. Thank you, Gene. And I know that for people who think, oh, well, you guys just get on to the subject matter, you can always just fast forward ahead. But when I have Gene on, we do like to talk about what he's up to and all these things.
There are people who actually just listen to my announcements and they
then they don't even want the regulars.
Exactly.
We have people who are the opposite.
You never know.
But I do want to say that that's very nice that you, I hadn't said anything publicly, but I'm glad that you mentioned that the note that I wrote to you, and I did make a somewhat substantial contribution to the Soho Forum, because I love what you're doing. I think it's very important. Also, I wanted to offer it as a gesture of thanks for your stalwart friendship with me over the years. Yes. But also now, Gene, the thing is that every time I look at these debates and I think, okay, each of these 2 debaters is being paid to come on here. And I don't always like the opposing debater. And I'm thinking, that SOB is going to be spending my money.
There you go, Tom, with your curmudgeonly ways. I was about to say, in a curmudgeonly fashion, I branded you as the Bobby Fischer of debating because you beat Michael Malice. That's like,
And then I went into retirement. Look, we're not hashing this one out again. If I think of a good topic, I'll come out of retirement.
I was about to say, because of your emolument, Tom, because of your contribution, I abandoned branding.
Oh, good.
So I'm forgiving you for that, Tom. And now you're being hard on me. The fact of the matter is, debating is stressful, as you know. It is stressful. And actually, I always cite you, Tom, and I mentioned that your point to people who appear before an audience delivering a talk, as Tom likes to say, just remember, everybody in the audience is pulling for you. And as I then put it, well, yeah, but except when you do a Soho Forum debate, maybe half the audience may have their knives out for you, but more importantly, there's somebody else on stage there to contradict what you say. So it is indeed a stressful time doing a Soho Forum debate, and that's partly what I pay for. And indeed, there are people I can't afford. I mean, the most I've ever paid was $3,000. Normally, I pay $1,500 to $2,000 to appear at the Soho Forum. And that's not a fortune for a speech. And certainly, it's combat pay for the ordeal and the tension of doing a debate on the Soho Forum stage. So That's my excuse for doing that, Tom. And I'm sure you're willing to allow some of that money to go to in the hands.
Look, when I made the donation, I knew what I was getting myself into, Gene. So, we don't need to shed too many tears for me. Absolutely. So let's talk about your recent debate. Yeah. Can you state what the resolution was?
The dismal performance of the U.S. economy over the past few decades is largely due to the influence of free market ideology.
Okay. And can you tell us a little bit of background about your opponent, Benjamin Appelbaum?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I'll, as usual, I'll give you more than you bargained for. It was actually in 2019 when Benjamin, who is chief editorial writer on economics for the New York Times, that he came out with his book called The Economist Hour, arguing this thesis. And I noticed that Russ Roberts of Econ Talk had him on the show, and Russ wrote an essay about Benjamin's argument, strongly disagreeing with it. And then I'd wanted to get Russ's debater. And so I cornered him. I said, Russ, you've written about this. Looks like you want to debate the issue. So I got Russ and Benjamin to agree to debate it. Then we got stymied by the lockdowns, and Russ did not want to do a Zoom debate, which I respected. And then Russ got a job in Israel, left the scene, left the area, because he's now head of some educational institution in Israel. So there was just me left. And I wrote Benjamin and I asked him, do you want to revive this debate and debate me on the subject? And he said yes. And I'm happy to have a New York Times economics editorial writer say yes and not insist on some of the very high fees some of the better known people at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal have asked of me. And so I decided I would debate him on this particular issue. And indeed, that's the thesis of his book. It's largely responsible, free market ideology. And I felt that in order for me to oppose his resolution with what I believe, that essentially progressive ideology is largely responsible, that I don't think I could defend that resolution in 20 minutes because there's so many nuances involved with it, especially defend it against somebody who's going to contradict it. So I took the tack by saying that Benjamin has taken on quite a burden, in the sense that he's going to prove that free market ideology is so dominant that it can be largely responsible for what goes on in the economy. Now, you might regard that as kind of a debater's angle, but I felt I had no alternative but to make that point, that I don't have the time to prove to you that progressive ideology is largely responsible, but I will try to show you that there's so much involved in what has gone on in the economy that it's slightly ludicrous to argue that there's such a thing as a free market ideology that has had so much dominance on the economy that is largely responsible for what goes on. So that's hopefully puts a framework on the approach that I took. Now, you listened to did you listen to the rest of the debate, Tom? How far did you go? Oh, you did?
No,
okay.
I did listen to the whole thing,
but
I stopped.
From there, Tom. I want your criticisms of what I did.
No, I like the way you did the Q&A. I think, honestly, Gene, I think this was of the ones I've seen, I think this was your strongest performance.
There you go. Well, okay. And then now let me say that what's interesting is that I started out with 68% of the vote in my favor, and Benjamin started out with 6% of the vote. And he gained 9 points from there, and I gained 6 points. So
yeah, I mean, but that also goes to show the trickiness sometimes of the format, and when the difference is so small, there are a lot of factors that can account for that. I mean, I don't understand what debate those people were watching.
Yeah, no, I
mean, he even conceded. Let's start getting into some of this.
Yes.
I mean, he even conceded one of your points right there in front of you when you said, "Look, you're looking at it." You can elaborate in a minute, but
sure.
You're looking at a trend that's just an artifact of the way you're doing the statistics. And you did this to him a couple of times.
Yeah.
But you said, look, if you would just listen to how the Bureau of Labor Statistics itself says to use these statistics, nominal versus real GDP. Well, look, I did you a favor, Benjamin. I redid your numbers according to the way the BLS said they should be done. And it turns out there's no such trend. And then likewise, when he went and looked at economic growth in various decades, and you pointed out, okay, well, of course, it's just an arbitrary decision to say 1950 to 1959 or 1960 to 1969. What if I do 1961 to 1970, 1971, what if I just move it a year or two? It turns out the alleged trend also disappears.
Yes.
So first you're pointing out that free market ideology has very, very, very far from taken over the U.S. government. But then secondly, your own numbers, if you just move the years a couple years, your trend disappears. And if you do the numbers correctly, the trend disappears. I mean, what's left after you do that?
Yes, and that's as I actually, I felt a little more than usually responding in a pleasant way when you wrote me that unsolicited note about what I said in my initial talk, because I walked away a little bit depressed, so to speak, that Benjamin could pick up any votes at all after what I argued. Because once I made points of that kind and also talked about how, if you want to talk about inequality, how government policies are fostering inequality in an important way, and he conceded that point as well. Once he gave all that ground, he began to beat a hasty retreat to some sort of like broader concept, which is that you need a balance between government and the free market. And so in a way, he shifted the focus altogether. It was no longer about blaming the free market for the performance of the U.S. economy. He just backed away and sort of took the high ground and tried to argue that, according to his model of the world, government should play a proactive role in the economy. Yes, we need capitalism, but we also need government. And so I had to counter with statements about crony capitalism and about all the dangers of introducing government. And in that sense, we lost the focus. Hopefully, toward the end, again, I returned to the point and I said, remember, that the resolution is about the free market being largely responsible. And Benjamin has basically conceded my point. He's just at least arguing that it's a mixed bag. He doesn't know what's responsible and what's not. He conceded my point about the housing market and government intervention in the housing market causing inequality. So where is his argument? His only argument was that he wants us to all think that the New York Times conception of the world is a proper one and that you do need government involved in the economy. And one of my assistants afterwards said that it is amazing that if you just make a nice impression, you've got a suit and tie, and you make a nice point about the happy medium between government and the economy, then people are going to vote for you. And they vote for your proposition, even though that wasn't what you were arguing in the first place. So I was a little bit miffed about that, but I guess it was a successful evening overall in terms of my own views. You summarized them fairly well, Tom, at least in broad brushstrokes. I took seriously the argument that he made in his book. He made an argument in his book about, as you briefly alluded, he made an argument in his book that from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s into the aughts, U.S. economic growth, as he was measuring it, slowed down in each successive decade. And he made that argument that it's very difficult for us to explain growth, but look at the pattern. It slowed down in each successive decade. And I spent copiously quoting him to make it clear how important this thesis was to him. And where I got laughter from the audience is I showed that the only reason why he was able to get his result from the 70s to the 80s is that he took growth rates to 3 decimal points.
3 decimal points. But that's not real. That doesn't mean anything. Yeah. It can't possibly be real.
Right. So, of course, it can't possibly be real in the world in which these growth, you can't even take it to 2 decimal points in this world of gross approximations. So, I initially was thinking of using the joke that economists show their sense of humor when they use decimal points in their measurement. But then I didn't have so much time. So I used the other joke, which is that if you torture numbers long enough, they'll confess to anything. So I said, Benjamin clearly thought the 3 decimal torture treatment was important because this is the only way he gets his result. I said, if you take it to 2 decimal places, he loses his conclusion. So,
well, let me ask you this. Yeah. What is he claiming is the causal relationship between, let's stipulate for the sake of argument, that free market thought just took over everything, including government, over the past 50 years. Let's just take that as a given for the sake of argument. Then what is he saying is the causal connection between free market policies and sluggish growth, such that if government were more involved, we'd have more vigorous growth? How does he think it works?
Well, this is perhaps the toughest question you've asked me on all the interviews I've done with you. Now you're asking me to take Benjamin's argument and put the best face on it, Tom. So
right, exactly.
I'm stuttering a little bit. I did say, I'll answer your question partly this way, Dom, and then I'll see if I can plunge in and answer it more sincerely. I did say that the reason I took his measurement seriously was that was the only part of his book, part of his argument, where at least I could say that's an attempt at measuring something. I mean, even though his causal connections are loose, because otherwise I said briefly, he's just talking conjecture. All he seems to be saying is that, well, a number of free market economists were sounding off a little bit more than usual. And
then we got poorer growth, so therefore one must have caused the other. But what is the causal connection is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, okay. Well, bear in mind, let's see, what did he say? And I read his book. As well. He did say that antitrust got more lax, that they weren't policing the cartels enough. He did make the argument, and again, he made the argument that Milton Friedman got his way with respect to how the Federal Reserve should handle the money supply. Now, you might fault me, Tom, that he actually said that in the debate, and I didn't challenge it. I mean, and he didn't even put much flesh on this in his book. Milton Friedman, to the extent that he was coherent at all about what the Federal Reserve should do, said that the Federal Reserve should basically turn itself into a computer, and it should define the money supply in a certain way, and that it should look for stable growth in the money supply. That's what Milton Friedman wanted, and Milton Friedman did not get his way. So, I mean, that's not what the Federal Reserve ever did. And so there, too, he's got problems. He made an assertion about how Milton Friedman succeeded in getting an end to the draft. We no longer draft people into the Army forcibly, and there's some connection there. Let me see. Look, you heard what he said, so therefore maybe you can pick up on some of his lame arguments.
Well, he wasn't making, from what I recall, an argument about industrial policy, that like it's better if the government kind of chooses where investment funds go and picks industries that it thinks will do well, and you don't have that in a free market. So I didn't hear that, which I do hear from other people. Rather than go over what his strong points were, one of his arguments that you just mentioned was he says that over time, because of allegedly lax antitrust enforcement, we saw the growth of cartels. But I think even here, this is more speculation than really rigorous empirical work here, because because, for example, he was saying that in airfares, we see the airlines have formed some type of, secret agreements or whatever. But you kept saying, but during the relevant period, airfares have fallen. And you would think, if we're going to see the effects of these things that you're positing, where would we see them if not in the prices? And then the best he could do with that was, well, in Europe, they're even lower. But that's irrelevant, because the issue is, if cartel activity was increasing in the U.S., then in the U.S., prices should be increasing.
Yes.
The only relevant comparison is between the United States now and the United States in the past. And the data supports your position.
Yes, absolutely. And, you summarized my argument quite well. That is what I said. I threw up some price indexes, and I said, look, Benjamin is saying that they fixed prices. So look at the price indexes and find evidence for it there. Benjamin said, well, look at France. And I responded by saying, well, look at the U.S. history against itself. Prices are declining, more price cutting than price increases. So we just see no evidence for it. And at the end of the day, by the way, when I quoted, one thing you didn't mention, I quoted Benjamin on the state of poverty in the early 1960s, where he wrote, without citing any data, that people were mired in poverty, no progress was being made, and that scholars and journalists came forward in the early 1960s to say that the only way to diminish the rate of poverty in America, as conventionally measured, would be for government to step in. And so then I quoted Charles Murray, of course, was a specialist in the subject, who pointed out that actually going into from 1949 through 1964, the year that the war on poverty was announced, we had the fastest decline in the rate of poverty that has been a matter of modern record. And so they didn't look at the data. They didn't care. And I tried then to point out that this seems to be Benya's failing, that you look at something like, and of course he harped on basically all the problems that we face. He said, look at this horrifying fact that life expectancy is declining in the U.S. Look at the horrifying fact that we have greater inequality in the U.S. Look at all these bad things. And then I said, and then the mindset is just that the free market must be to blame. No, you don't look at any of the real data. You don't examine it in any causal way, but your knee-jerk attitude is it's the free market. And so if Benya is capable of reporting this completely mistaken view about the progress against poverty into the 1960s, then he's capable of assuming anything. And that's why it bothered me that anybody in the audience could possibly vote for his resolution. By the way, just to back up, you might even ask me, why did I spend Tom Woods' his hard-earned money on inviting Binya to the Soho Forum. If his
he's a prominent person.
Exactly. Okay. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah.
He's a prominent person, and he's New York Times. And
I'm very happy with how you've been spending my money, Gene.
Okay, that's good, Tom. See, I'm answerable to you. You see, now you're my boss, Tom. You're one of my donors. You're a big deal now, Tom. I used to treat you in this rough fashion. Now I got to call you Mr. Woods. But anyway, absolutely. Yeah. So that's the point. And so indeed, I invited him for that reason. But I'll tell you one thing. Really, Binya just wanted to do a book. He probably talked to his publisher, and he wanted to do a book that it would have some kind of cutting edge. So it's the economist's hour. The free market economists are taken over. I can tell this sort of loose conjectural narrative, and that can be my thesis. And I can sell some books. So that really was what his book was all about. And actually, though, I'm at least happy. The one part of it that I was most happy about being able to talk about was that indeed government intervention in restrictive licensure and in the housing market, it has in a major way contributed to a disparity of income, a disparity of wages and salaries in the U.S. economy. And so at least I was able to sort of hit Binya where he lives in that sense, that I'm not going to say that there's been no inequality to object to. I will say that there has been, and that's what's staring us in the face. And then on top of that, Binya had written some articles about housing. We should connect the dots a little bit better. So I was able to show at least that you can blame government intervention for these things. So in that sense, I sort of turned the tables on him. And that's where he just pretty much conceded the point. And that, too, it was pleasantly surprising to me that he was able to concede the point and then to withdraw and simply say that it's a mixed bag. We don't really know what is going on. And if that's the case, he can't really defend his resolution. But at the end of the day, I hope that a lot of people watch the debate, and I hope a lot of people get an understanding of the kinds of viewpoints that come out of the New York Times, this sort of lack of thought, lack of analysis, and sort of knee-jerk objection to what goes on without giving it any forethought. Well, I wanted to mention a couple of other things, though, Tom. As you can see, I did not want to contradict Binya about his dirge with respect to the performance of the U.S. economy. You did mention that I quoted him briefly about the way he was analyzing wages and salaries as a percentage of gross domestic product. And I was on your show most recently talking about that mismeasurement. And I recommend that you listen to the show I did with Tom Woods recently about the mismeasurement of compensation as a share of the economy. I did mention that, but I could have mentioned a number of other things. A book that you have frequently cited, Thomas Sowell's Discrimination and Disparities. In that book, one of the most shocking passages is, and I'm going to read it briefly, is when Sowell makes the point about social mobility. I want to read two sentences from Sowell's book about social mobility. Sowell writes, "Social mobility is the extent to which a society permits upward and downward movement. How much movement actually takes place depends also on the extent to which individuals and families avail themselves of the opportunities." And that's a very crucial point, completely non-politically correct. Sowell points out how many immigrant groups seem to have been very socially mobile. And he points out that other groups have not availed themselves of the opportunity to be socially mobile. And that would have been a non-PC point for me to introduce, which I avoided introducing, because you have to be a Thomas Sowell to have the guts to make that kind of argument. Sowell was pointing out that economists like Joseph Stiglitz and Angus Deaton is another economist who won the Nobel Prize, take it for granted that when you see less social mobility, it's because people are being pushed around, because they're being denied the opportunity to be socially mobile. Thomas Sowell points out that maybe they're not availing themselves of those opportunities, especially when you see how immigrant groups do avail themselves of that opportunity and others do not. And so that's a good example of the way in which I wanted to avoid sounding like the right-wing heavy who's cynical about human beings. It's Thomas Sowell who has the courage to make a point of that kind.
Hey, folks, let's take a minute to thank our sponsor, CrowdHealth. One of the reasons you and I don't do what everybody else does just automatically is because a lot of those people are, frankly, lemmings just running off a cliff. And that holds true for healthcare also. We all know the current system is broken, but thanks to CrowdHealth, we can do something about it. CrowdHealth is just a better way to fund your healthcare costs than the traditional insurance system. You see any doctor you want, no deductibles, exclusions, or copays. You pay only the first $500 of any healthcare event. The CrowdHealth community takes care of the rest. CrowdHealth reverses the vicious incentives that got us into this mess in the first place, that, of course, they always blame on capitalism. You pay one low monthly total to fund your account, and that monthly subscription helps fund healthcare costs of the entire CrowdHealth community. And unlike insurance companies, CrowdHealth actually helps you find great care at a fair price, always pays doctors as quickly as possible, and actively negotiates to keep costs down for everyone. Take charge of your healthcare today with CrowdHealth. Open enrollment is the only time you can hit eject on the broken system without penalty, so don't wait. And for a limited time, join for just $99 per month for your first 6 months when you use promo code WOODS at joincrowdhealth.com. That's joincrowdhealth.com, promo code WOODS. CrowdHealth is not health insurance. It's a totally different way of paying for healthcare. Terms and conditions may apply. I guess it's safe to say that two of the main planks, though, in your presentation had to do with, first of all, undermining what looked from his presentation to be very clear and robust trends about growth and inequality, and then showing that actually this is just an artifact of the way the data is being collected and there's not much to it. And then the other side of it also was to question the premise, namely that free market thought has actually been victorious. And you did that primarily through two major points. One was the growth of the public sector as expressed in the size of the federal budget. And secondly, the growth of the regulatory state as expressed in the number of pages in the Federal Register, which has basically more than tripled since 1960. Now, later in the debate, when this subject came up and people were saying, well, what do you make of this? I mean, obviously, if you look at the trend in regulation, the number of pages in the Federal Register, it's much, much higher now than it was. I mean, how do you reconcile this with your idea that free market ideology has been triumphant? And he very dismissively said, well, there are ways to measure how heavy the regulatory burden is. And one way you wouldn't do that is by looking at the number of pages in the Federal Register. And Gene, for a brief moment, I felt slightly ashamed. I thought, I guess I am too simplistic. And then I stopped and thought, wait a minute, why not? Just because he asserts that I shouldn't? Why would I not look at the very volumes that include all the regulations? Why would the size of that not be some kind of indicator?
Yes. Well, you touched on a number of points where I listened to the debate. I subjected myself to watching myself up there. And I had obviously some painful moments. He, in his initial rebuttal, he dismissed the idea that the pages matter. I did briefly say in my first rebuttal, that when you're looking, again, the numbers were, you're looking at a tripling since 1969, 58,000 pages of rules and regs and up to 180,000, a tripling. I thought probably I should have said, well, Binya wants to make the point that, well, some of these pages are innocuous. They're more garrulous when they write all the instructions into the regulations and all the rest. I'm really sorry I didn't say, well, Binya, I'll spot you 100,000 pages. I'll give you, that's right. I should have said that. And then you still get an increase of 35%. So you're really going to say it went. You can't say which direction it went when you're looking at a tripling from 58,000 to 180,000. So those little phrases, I didn't mention that. I did say, look, we're looking at a tripling from 58,000 to 180,000. And then I let the point go. I let it go partly because as the debate kept going, he kept more or less conceding that it's a mixed bag and that we really can't say what's largely responsible. But going back, by the way, I want to correct you. I quoted the Fred data on government expenditures, which is federal, state, and local, all separated out, with no double counting, up to 40% of GDP. He didn't even challenge that. I didn't press it too much. But by the way, I want to emphasize this one point. I think you're finessing, Tom. I did want to emphasize that I was willing to agree that there is an inequality issue that free market people can worry about, and that has to do with the very good quantitative research that's been done on the ways in which people of basically high school diploma types have been shut out of the very expensive real estate markets that can't take advantage of the higher wages, but college-age people can. So the point is, I did want to shock him by getting into his own arena. No, I'm not denying that there are concerns about inequality. I'm only pointing out that what stares us in the face has to do with local government policy that makes it impossible to build, makes it so expensive to build that people of limited means find it very costly to move to high-wage areas. I also mentioned, of course, restrictive licensure. So that was key as well in my argument, and that's where Binya began to back off. But at the end of the day, his argument really was essentially that he wanted to write a book, he wanted to say something about the free market, and at the end, we basically could not get into the real issues. And that's, of course, the limitation of any debate encounter. The real issues having to do with the role of government. By the way, I think his worst moment was when I said to him that you have a crony capitalist system. And I mentioned Goldman Sachs. I figured that would get him emotionally aroused. I said, but Goldman Sachs, the people who run Goldman Sachs, they're running government. Next thing you know, they're also running Goldman Sachs. We've got those very people that Benjamin disapproves of running the government. That's crony capitalism. That's their power. And so Benjamin lamely responded by saying, I object to that too. But what is the alternative? What's the alternative? And I said, the alternative is the profit and loss system. Profits encourage risk-taking, losses encourage prudence. But when the government steps in and protects companies from losses, then you have a screwed up system. And I let him have the last word in our little exchange because I can get a little riled up. I want to calm down a little bit. He then said, the profit and loss system. But I'm not too happy with that because, Goldman had some losses. So that's when he began to stutter a little bit, and I left it at that. So in a way that we were beginning to touch on the edges of what the economy is all about. Another colleague of mine, again, also faulted me for not mentioning public choice theory. What motivates government? The crony capitalist system, the power that they seek, that's what I was emphasizing. And of course, public choice, which is what the bureaucrats choose to do. And so that Benjamin's ideal that we need more government power, that's ridiculous. Look, I let some other things go by. For example, when he talks about, imagine having to sit up there, Tom, what I had to go through, sitting up there and listening to Benjamin talk about how the recent pandemic has taught us how important government is, in helping us, I was about to say, look, the recent pandemic taught us how destructive government can be, and how many people died abroad, poor people in poor areas died abroad because of the draconian lockdowns that made no sense. So bear in mind, I had to listen to him come out with that howler. Another one, which is really rather comical, I'm almost sorry I missed this opportunity. He talks about how government does all kinds of wonderful things. Like, you people live in New York, you're used to all these great things that government does. I don't know if you recall that he said that as well. Oddly, the only thing I thought that maybe as a practical matter I could have challenged was this. Benjamin used a measure of wages and salaries as a share of gross domestic product to show that, and I showed his chart, to show that labor is getting a decreasing share of the pie. I showed, and again, if you actually listen to my recent interview with Tom, you can understand a little bit better what I was talking about, but I showed that he was ignoring the advice of the Bureau of Economic Analysis by using a wrong numerator and a wrong denominator. And that if you use compensation, which includes benefits, and compensation as a percentage of net domestic product, you find there's been no downtrend. And you briefly summarized that point earlier. But Benjamin then got up there and responded to me by talking about the numerator, that he'd left out benefits. And I mentioned briefly when I talked about benefits, I said, Benya, you work for the New York Times. I'm sure that those health benefits and all the other benefits that you get apart from your salary are important to you. And he actually said that the health benefits are not worth any more than they were decades ago. And that's why he didn't include them, which was an odd, ignorant thing to say. And I'm a little bit sorry I didn't respond by pointing out that as critical as I might be of those health benefits, the medical establishment really is a little bit better in protecting us against problems like leukemia, giving us bone marrow transplants. There really has been an improvement in medical care over the last few decades. But apart from that, the companies are spending money on it. These are their outlays. And so that's why you have to include it. That gets into the weeds a little bit. But oddly, when you listen to a debate and you say, where could I have stepped in? What opportunity did I not take the opportunity to correct him on. It was that particular technical issue. I had to sit there and let him talk about how the lockdowns taught us that government is so important and how living in New York City. I might have been able to quip and say, Binion, by the way, lives in Washington, D.C. That's probably why it's an inflated view of how valuable we regard our New York City government services with respect to the schools and the police. So I could have said that as well. Anyway, I appreciate you giving me a reasonable grade on how I did, Tom, or even saying that it's my best yet, because you thought I did pretty well against what's his name, Richard Wolff, the socialist. Remember, you had me on to discuss that one as well.
Right. Well, let's take 1 minute, let's take 60 seconds.
Okay.
What do you think? Did you think he had a particularly strong point? I know you prepare pretty well. You read what people say, you listen to their interviews, so you're not usually surprised by what they say.
Wow.
But was there anything in the debate where you thought, well, that one does kind of land a little bit?
God. Wow. Let me see. That one does kind of land a little bit. Well, in terms of making a causal analysis that the free market is largely responsible for the dismal performance of the U.S. economy. So you have to show that the free market became increasingly influential on the level of government. And then you have to show direct causal connections between what the government did and how the performance of the economy in terms of what? Inequality, in terms of slower pattern of growth. And I don't know that anything that he said actually held up. Oddly enough, the only thing that I can commend him on is that he kept his cool. He speaks very well. He makes a nice impression. And he very gracefully sort of maneuvered himself to back off and simply say that we need a balance between the government and the free market. And I'm for capitalism, but I'm also for government. And so we need a happy medium. And I think he was very adroit in making that statement. But I can't say that the statement that he made held up in any rigorous sense. I can only say that it made a very nice impression, and it depressed me a little bit to find that all you really have to do with some people who watch a debate is to make a nice impression, and they'll vote for the resolution that you are supposed to be defending. So maybe that sounds like sour grapes. Tom, you listen to the debate. Maybe you can come out and tell me where you thought he shined, where you thought he made a good point here and there. What do you think, Tom?
Well, I do think that image of himself as the wise moderate probably played well with some people.
Yes, yeah.
You know, that you're the free market ideologue, and he's magnanimous enough to concede that, yes, the free market has its place.
Yeah.
So I think with the average person, that comes off better.
Yes.
You know, I'm not an extreme in either direction. But the fact that you eviscerated his claims and saying, look, all I did was move the years over a couple of years and your trend completely disappears. Well, there it goes. Like the whole thing's over. So anyway, I want people to support you by, of course, it'd be nice if they contributed, but also by spreading the word about the debates, watching the debates. Yes. Remember, you can see past debates. You can find out about future ones at thesohoforum.org. That's THESOHO forum.org.
Yes.
There's a Soho Forum podcast where the debates come out in audio form and podcast form. You can listen to them on the go, but it's a really, really great thing. And they are good, meaty, interesting, important topics. Mm-hmm. So thank you, Gene, for that and for being here today.
Sure, and then let me add, Tom, because, of course, I always get the last word here, that despite the fact that Tom gave a very generous contribution to the Soho Forum, and it makes a big difference to us, and we have other donors, some of whom have even deeper pockets than Tom, like the Smith Family Foundation, that gives us more than half the funds. And despite the fact that we also earn money by selling tickets, I take no salary from the Soho Forum still, because we're still operating on a shoestring. And by the way, I'm not a very good fundraiser. I've got to practice that. At doing that, I got be a little bit better at that. With Tom Woods, of course, I can just be my crazy self and he'll give me money because he tolerates me. But other people, I have to know how to raise money. Despite all that, we could be doing more. We could afford maybe some pricier people. We could take the show on the road. We could take it to campuses. If we had even more money, we have enough to function and to do a debate every month, 12 debates a year at the very least, maybe 13 to 14 debates in the coming year. We now have debates planned through April. So if you go on our website, you will find debates planned through April. And Tom, actually, I was forced to stagger some of the dates because obviously you have to set it so that two people can be in New York City at the same time. Maybe you can come to one of them yourself. In any case, look at our website, you too, Tom, and you'll find the dates in New York City between now and next April. Again, the one that's coming up is with Jay Bhattacharya and Sten Verman, basically debating the lockdowns. That's November 15th, and I hope you all come. And Tom, thanks again for your generous donation.
Gene, thanks for being Gene Epstein. I appreciate it. Until next time, Thank you, Gene, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit TomWoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.